What's going on, everybody? It's your boy, the Financial Conspirator. Today, we're going to be talking about MSTR outperformance and Bitcoin resilience, navigating volatility, seizing opportunity. So, what we got on the agenda: MSTR and Bitcoin fundamentals, price comparison, Bitcoin yield, Bitcoin profits, unrealized profits, stats per share, market sentiment, and then a few price predictions at the very end. So, the 1 year performance of MSTR is still outperforming the Mag 7 by over 100%. MSTR is up 177% over the last year, Nvidia 53%, Tesla 41%, Meta 35%, Apple 30%, Google 21%, Amazon 20%, and Microsoft negative 4%.
Very simply to me, they'd say, look, if you can't beat the S&P, give us the money back. Because a brainless investor can take the money and buy the S&P index, and they can do that. That is the hurdle rate. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if you're buying T-bills and you're getting 3% after tax, and if the hurdle rate is 12%, you're underperforming by 9%. That means holding $1 billion of capital, you burn $90 million a year. Holding $100 billion in capital, you burn $9 billion a year in shareholder value. And so the big idea here is that in the year 2024, the SEC approved the first digital commodity in the history of the world, Bitcoin, and fair value accounting became optional. And in January of 2025, this month, fair value accounting for that digital commodity became mandatory, and we expect in the first week of the Trump administration for SAB 121 to be repealed, and that means that every major bank in the world will be allowed to bank Bitcoin. So what you have is a status quo for 80 years where a corporation could have all of their assets in real estate, in gold, in soybeans, in oil, or in treasuries. But of course, the only thing that looks liquid and fungible is treasuries, and it doesn't beat the cost of capital. And now Satoshi invents this new digital commodity. It takes 15 years for people to decide that it isn't tulip bulbs. It takes many years for the government to embrace it. And in the year 2025 is probably the first year where you could reasonably say the banks will probably handle it, the government's not going to ban it, and it really is a commodity. And so now, if you run a publicly traded company, you have a choice between Bitcoin or bonds. And the bonds are minus 10% real yield, and the Bitcoin is plus 45% real yield for the past 8 years. And you know, you might not be sure that you're going to keep getting plus 45% real yield, but I would submit to you that even if Bitcoin's returns collapse to the S&P index, and if you said it's just as good as the S&P, having a commodity that performs like the S&P is 10% better than using a bond. And so the real revolution in corporate finance for a CEO is you have the opportunity to recapitalize a company on a BTC standard instead of a USD standard. And what that means physically is you go from being negatively polarized to capital to being positively polarized to capital. Instead of being repulsive to capital, you're attractive. Wouldn't you like to walk into a meeting and be attractive instead of being repulsive when you walk in the meeting? And what that means to MicroStrategy is we just stumbled on this. We discovered this. We weren't trying to discover it. We were in the middle of the lockdowns, and we were kind of irritated, frustrated, desperate. And so we had $500 million of capital with zero return, and we thought we got to invest in something. Should we buy gold? Should we buy art? Should we buy real estate? Should we buy diamonds? Or should we buy crypto gold? And we thought, well, we'll buy some crypto gold called Bitcoin, and we inadvertently recapitalized to the BTC standard. And then, of course, if your capital is returning more than the S&P 500, you're creating shareholder value. How much capital can you gather? Like, If I'm a hedge fund and I say I return consistently twice the S&P 500, how much do you want to invest in me? The answer is, how much money do you want? And if I go to you and I say I'm a hedge fund and I consistently underperform the S&P by 50%, how much capital do you want to invest in me? None. You're either magnetically attracting the capital or you're rejecting it. So MicroStrategy stumbled on a new idea: recapitalize on an asset which is accretive, not dilutive. And when we did that, we started attracting more capital. We went from having 500 million of cash non-performing, like a liability, to having 45 billion worth of Bitcoin going up 60% a year. And we went from a $600 million enterprise value to a $100 billion enterprise value. And we went from not being able to borrow any money to borrowing $7 billion for almost nothing. And we went from not being able to sell, we couldn't have sold the entire company for $10 a share. We couldn't have sold it for $1 billion or whatever, to being able to sell $18 billion of equity at, 30x the price. And what's happening? It's, we simply change the polarity of the balance sheet. And I think that's the exciting opportunity for a public company, or any financeable company. Any company that can raise equity or debt financing has a use of proceeds which is transparent, high speed, accretive, and scalable. And you didn't have it 4 years ago. You didn't have it 10 years ago. You never had it for 100 years. All corporate finance textbooks, every course at Harvard, they're all built on a US dollar treasury standard in the absence of a crypto capital network. And I think now you have to rethink corporate finance. You have to rethink everything.
You just said so much.
Right. So what happens when the hurdle rate becomes Bitcoin? Companies aren't trying to outperform the S&P. They're trying to outperform 60% a year. And the only way to do that is by buying Bitcoin. Now, what if there aren't enough Bitcoin on the market for companies like Apple or Amazon, Microsoft? Can Strategy start lending out its Bitcoin to these companies? I mean, we haven't even begun to talk about the products that they could actually launch, owning almost 3% of the supply. Demand isn't going anywhere, and they're not going to slow down.
Very, very.
So the Bitcoin yield strategy in the halfway point of Q1 has already given a Bitcoin yield of nearly 7% to shareholders, and the target is 15% for the year. Like, the target last year was 8%, and they ended up doing 74%. So you hold one share in January, you have 74% more Bitcoin per share in December. And this year it's already at 7%. So that 15% is looking like a undershoot overperform. And I had this slide set up 3 days ago, and the unrealized profit was 10 billion from Friday to Sunday. 3 billion, 4 billion in profit, and we're looking good for the fair value accounting change coming for Q1 2025. So the next earnings call, people are going to see the volatility and the strength adopting Bitcoin could have. I mean, and it could go to the downside. If Bitcoin crashes, we could see a really bad earnings call, quote unquote bad. It's unrealized losses. And again, the sats per share trend, it cost you nearly 6,000 shares of MicroStrategy in 2020 to get one equivalent of Bitcoin. Now it's under 600. So as the US dollar price drops, you are gaining more Bitcoin per share. So this volatility downside is absolutely a positive. You want prices to go down so you can buy more. When your shoes go down that you wanted to have in your cart, when those go down 20%, you're not panicking. Oh my God, my shoes! Those are the same shoes. It's the same company. It's just priced a little bit less. There's more value in it for you now. There's no reason to be panicking. And the market sentiment. The RSI hasn't been this low since the FTX crisis and the 2019-2020 COVID crisis. Greedy when others are fearful. That's really all I've got for you folks. The current MNAV for MSTR 1.6, 1.7. You could check that on mstrtracker.com. But if we were to see Bitcoin go back to 100,000 and the MNAV in between 2.5 to 3.5, we could be seeing MSTR north of 600, north of 800, or north of $1,000, depending on where the MNAV is going. So over time, the farther out we'll go, the more you'll realize 250, 230 was an incredible buying opportunity. So either you'll be kicking yourself or you'll be proud. That's all I got for you this weekend. I'll see you on Monday.